Hello everyone, and welcome back to Pale Shadows. I'm your storyteller, and I'm here to guide you through tonight's tale. I know many of you come here to relax, unwind, and maybe even drift off to sleep. So before we begin, take a moment, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time of night is it for you? Now find a comfortable spot, let the world slow down around you, and allow the story to carry you into the calm, the lease that signed itself. The building pretended not to notice her at first. It had the narrow-shouldered posture of old downtown apartments, sandstone skin scarred by a century of rain, eyelids of soot over windows that had watched too much. Nadia stood at the curb with 2 tote bags and a folded printout from a rental site, looking up at the dented cornice where pigeons huddled like punctuation. When the wind shifted, the sign over the doorway creaked and turned its name toward her. The way a stranger turns their face. The Belgrave! A smear of gold paint clung to the letters like memory clinging to a bruise. "You're early," the superintendent called, appearing behind the glass like an apparition in a TV screen. She was small and perfectly upright, with silver hair swept into a knot so tight it leached the fatigue from her face. That's good. Early means decisive. "I'm just on time," Nadia said automatically. She checked her phone, then slipped it into her coat pocket and tried to keep her breath even. She hadn't slept well in weeks. The on-call schedule carved days into unreliable fragments, and now every sound had edges. The hospital's monitors had taught her heartbeat math. She could count a second even with the world loud and unstable. She could also tell when a building was holding its breath. "Elevator's temperamental," the woman said. "We take the stairs. I'm Mrs. Petrov." She stepped aside. "Welcome to Belgrave." The lobby had the sticky hush of a place that had perfected the art of waiting. An elaborate floral rug dreamt across cracked tile. A brass mailbox panel covered one wall, each slot labeled with letters that had been pried off and stuck back. On, in slightly wrong arrangements, someone had buffed the panel recently. Nadia saw her smudged face multiplied in golden rectangles, peering through a film of distortion. "Your ad mentioned heat included," Nadia said, "because you said practical. Things to prove your voice worked. And water. Heat, water, trash, the ghosts of your neighbors," Mrs. Petrov said. It might have been a joke in another mouth. "1 bedroom, 4th floor, corner unit, good light." The stairwell carried the smell of old wood rubbed with lemon oil and tea. Extinguished candles, their footfalls tapped up through the volumes of the building, through the layered voices of people who had argued and cooked and whispered here 100 years ago. A man passed them on the 3rd floor landing. He wore a moving company back brace but no uniform, no boxes, no reason to be there. He nodded to Nadia, and then, when he thought she wasn't looking, counted the steps under his breath as he continued, down. The 4th floor corridor was long and narrower than it wanted to be, like it had been tightened afterward. Electric sconces hummed at a pitch that sat exactly at the back of Nadia's jaw. She knew the frequencies of incision saws and centrifuges, the whine of suction, the deep choir of MRI magnets. The hum in the corridor didn't belong to any of those. It was close to the sound the ICU clocks made just before they failed. "4C," said Mrs. Petrov, stopping at the last door on the right. The window at the end of the hall brightened the air. Outside, a sliver of river showed between 2 buildings, a coin of light flipping on its edge. "Corner unit, cross breeze." The key was old enough to have stories, heavy in Nadia's palm. It turned with a reluctance that struck her as almost moral. The door opened onto a room like a held breath, polished wood floors, a radiator under a high window, a living room and looping hallway, and the suggestion of a bedroom beyond. Dust drifted in the angled light like pale confetti that refused to land. "Kitchen's been updated," said Mrs. Petrov. Fridge is new, gas stove, no microwave, but that's what counters are for. She set a blank manila folder on the counter. Lease is straightforward. 12 months, 1 month deposit. You'll like it here, Miss Khan, Nadia said. Nadia. Khan, repeated the super, not writing it down. Right. Nadia walked through the spaces the way a person tests their name in a new mouth. She reached the bathroom where the clawfoot tub looked like an animal resting, saw the mirror, above the sink with its black spots, its frame of old wood that had absorbed more steam than it wanted. In the bedroom, the window faced another building, and between them the air made a private street of sky. Someone had left a hook in the ceiling, in a place where no hook would ever be useful. The walls had been painted, the beige landlords believed, could exorcise whatever a previous tenant had thought. From the living room, she heard paper flip. She found the manila folder spread open like a polite threat on the kitchen counter, a standard lease. Her name printed in a neat sans serif at the top. Tenant, Nadia Khan. She slid a finger along the edge of the paper and felt the drag of a misaligned cut, like a seam where 2 times had been taped together. Can I take this to look through? She asked. I like to read everything. You can read everything right here, said the super. She indicated a folding chair that had appeared beside the counter, as if the building had been keeping it behind its back. There's a pen. Nadia liked rules. She liked the way rules made the world shareable. She sat, smoothed the lease, and began to read. She ran her finger under the clauses about late payment and subletting and the right of re-entry. She circled the bit that said landlord may enter without notice in case of emergency and the bit that said tenants shall not alter any lock. She had friends who'd moved through apartments like water. Nadia had been born in a 2-bedroom above a grocery and lived there for 19 years. Stability had taught her superstition about signatures. Names deserved pauses. Initial there, said Mrs. Petrov, tapping a place near the bottom. And there. Nadia looked. The boxes for initials were already filled. NK in tiny, careful letters. The ink wasn't the black of the printed text. It sat glossily on the page like a stubborn scab. She blinked and felt the back of her neck prick. I didn't, she began, but the words sounded vain in the room, like a person pretending they'd never broken a glass. Printer must have glitched, said the super. Sometimes the forms copy weird. We use a template. Initial there too. Tap, tap, Nadia traced her finger along the letters. They weren't stamped. She could see the way the pen had hesitated on the serif of the K, lifted, then come back to finish the slant, as though the writer had second-guessed her own hand. She would not say my hand, she would not. The signature lines lay at the bottom, like a final corridor. Tenant signature, empty. She picked up the pen, cheap plastic, the kind that refused to take responsibility, and the tip scratched a promise into the paper. She hesitated, then signed. She had learned to sign quickly in the hospital, her name a smooth shape that allowed no interruptions. The line absorbed the ink and looked suddenly older, as if it had grown out of the page rather than been placed on it. She dated the signature, November 3rd, and only then saw the date in the corner of the page. Received, October 10th. That's not right, she said. She looked up. It says you received this. Clerical, said the super. We don't hold that against you, but I didn't even see the ad until last week. We had a cancellation, said the super, and smiled with the precise number of teeth required to end a conversation without being rude. People change their minds. Nadia capped the pen. The click sounded too loud. Somewhere in the building, a pipe knocked, then knocked again, as if remembering something it had meant to say. You're a night worker, said the super. She didn't ask it. She pinned it to the air and left it there to dry. I'm a medical intern, Nadia said. Cardiology, nights mostly. She expected the usual responses. Bless you, poor thing, I could never. But the super only nodded with a peculiar attentiveness, as if she were listening for the sound that information made. You'll like the hours here. she said. "It rests when you rest." "The building?" "Everything rests when watched," said the super. "We'll need first month and deposit, cashier's check. You'll get 2 keys. Mailbox is downstairs. We'll add your name to the board." They finished the business with a handful of short sentences. The apartment had no furniture except the folding chair and a dust shadow where a previous tenant's bookshelves had been. Nadia stood in the center of the living room and tried to see herself moving through the space, the workflow from door to table, the angle of the lamp she would use for late reading, the place where she would kick off her shoes and forget them. The radiator ticked the measured way a heart does when it's trying to return to a rhythm. Tick, pause, tick-tick. She looked at the window. A trolley squealed down on River Street, the sound an animal learning an old language. Nadia imagined her name on the buzzer panel downstairs and felt the subdermal shiver of a migration accomplished. "Welcome," said the super again, and this time it felt less like a word and more like a lid closing. Nadia moved in with 2 suitcases, 3 boxes of books, and a coffee maker that had only 1 setting. Too much. She carried everything herself because asking for help felt like making a mess you had no right to make. By evening, 4C looked like the bare-bones version of a life. Mattress on the floor, books stacked in columns that pretended they were end, tables, a single framed print leaning against the wall. From her mother. She unpacked a clean set of scrubs and hung them in the bedroom closet where the poles squeaked like something small and fretful. Her mother had typed, "You forget." A message from Omar, a fellow intern who had been gently trying to become something else. "You good? Still alive?" She typed brief answers and put the phone face down as if to keep the messages from evaporating. The sun slid off the windows like water leaving a blade. Streetlight turned the ceiling a tired yellow. Nadia brewed coffee because her hands missed tasks and sat on the floor with her back against the wall, going through the folder again. No reason. No reason at all. Her signature looked like it regarded her. Her initials had the obedient posture of someone who had been here longer than she had. The date, received October 10th, pushed at her with the quiet insistence of a dream you're trying to remember. Her watch, a cheap analog she trusted, more than her phone's. Soft numbers, said 7:46. The wall clock that hung in the kitchen from some previous tenant's sentimental attachment said 9:12 and then, as if reconsidering, 9:11. She had not wound it, she had not set it. It shrugged and took another step backward to 9:10 before deciding forward was less embarrassing. Nadia stood to take the clock down, but the screws that held it were too tight for her fingers. The clock ticked as if to prove it could. She decided to ignore it. While brushing her teeth, she caught her reflection smile just a fraction of a second after she did. Not a delay, more like an echo without a sound. She leaned toward the mirror to check the pupils that had seen too many night shift fluorescence. The glass offered back a face she recognized, and then, beneath it, something like static. She reached to wipe a hand tremor of steam from the glass with the side of her hand, and felt a streak of cold, not on the glass, but on the air, just in front of it, as if the space had a skin that had been peeled away. It was nothing. Fatigue. There were residents in her program who could sleep in 5-minute increments and function as if they'd been gently replaced by younger, less damaged relatives. Nadia's sleep came in hard squares. When it didn't arrive, everything kept its shape but lost its sense. She lay down and stared at the ceiling and counted quietly to 100, and then, because counting invited the hospital in, she started naming cities she remembered from an atlas her father loved: Lahore, Larkana, Lisbon, Lilongwe. She drifted along the L's until the ceiling softened, and her body did the thing bodies always do in rooms where they can hear themselves. Her eyes were open when the building exhaled. It was such a small thing, a change in the pressure that wrapped the room. The radiator gave a resigned pop. The hum in the hallway stepped closer and then, softly, retreated. Nadia looked at her watch, then at the kitchen clock, and then at her watch again, because repetition was a way to find edges. 1:17 a.m. slid under her like a wave. A faint scraping sound slid under the door, a whisper-thin complaint. She sat up. The scraping repeated, 2 inches of movement, then another. Nadia got to her feet, the carpet leaving its short, plush ghost on her knees. She went to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway's end window made a muted moon of itself. The corridor, empty to the radiator's quiet satisfaction. Nadia shrugged, unlatched the door, and opened it just far enough to look down. An envelope leaned against the threshold, as if it had traveled a long way and had to rest. Cream paper, the kind with a faint tooth that loves ink. No stamp. No return address. Her name written on the front in block letters that started confident and got a little lost in the middle. Nadia Khan. She picked it up and felt that it was warm, though the hall was not. A sound reached her from the end of the corridor, the soft ping of an elevator changing its mind. She closed the door, slid the chain, and stood in the kitchen without turning on the light. She didn't open the envelope. It wasn't superstition exactly. It was the experience of night pages at the hospital, the ones with numbers that began with stat or code, and the understanding that once you looked, you belonged to whatever the page asked. She slid the envelope into the manila folder with the lease and the photocopied emergency contact form, and the smiling welcome to Belgrave sheet with the trash days and the laundry room hours and the admonition against bicycles in the hallway. If the envelope made a sound when it touched the lease, it was too soft to swear to later. She slept. When Nadia woke, she didn't know what had woken her. A sound, a shift, the body's minor alarms. The light at the window was the particular pallor of city morning. The kitchen clock announced 6:12 with a posture that suggested it had always said that. Her watch said 6:45. She showered quickly, the water grudging but hot. In the mirror, her face looked like a person wearing her face. In the living room, she opened the manila folder with the same deliberate care she used with a patient's chart when family watched her hands. The lease lay like a placid animal, the ink calm on its flanks. The envelope sat beside it. She slit it with the blunt knife she'd unpacked into the wrong drawer. The paper inside was thick and smooth and smelled faintly of something like lemon and dust. The handwriting was small and exacting, an engineer's hand, a person who trusted a ruler. "Move the bed away from the vent," it said. "Don't sleep with your head under the window. There's a crack in the plaster above the left hinge of the bedroom door. Don't touch it." She stared at the words until they slid against her. The letter continued. "You'll hear footsteps tonight. It's only the building realigning. Ignore the first 2. Answer the third. Not the door, the wall."
"Use the heel of your hand. There was no signature." "Okay," Nadia said aloud, "because sound makes things choose a category." She looked at the vent. It was a handsome vent, as vents go, cast iron painted the same cowed beige as the walls. She put
her ear to it and listened. The building breathed, all buildings breathe. This breath had a rhythm she did not like. She looked at the bedroom window. Her bed, such as it was, lay with its head under it, because she had put it there without thinking. She pulled the mattress onto its side and dragged it to the opposite wall, an act that would have been easier with 2 people and a joke. As she raised the mattress against the wall, a fine rain of plaster powder sifted down from the place the letter had told her not to touch. She didn't touch it. She pressed her hand flat to the wood of the door instead, to remind the room that she existed. She dressed in scrubs, braid folded into a loop at the nape of her neck, coffee in a hospital mug she'd stolen by accident. She packed a bag with granola bars and a book she would not read, and skimmed the letter once more. The paper had a small crease at the bottom, as if a previous fold had been reversed. The building's stairwell smelled different in the morning, like newspapers and a person who had just left. Nadia paused at the mailbox panel. The slot labeled 4C bore no nameplate yet. A strip of masking tape waited for her to write herself into the metal. She found a Sharpie in her bag and wrote Khan carefully in capital letters. The tape bubbled, slightly, and then settled, like a breath withheld, then let go. At the front door, she glanced at the lobby clock without meaning to. 8 to 17, she blinked. She had not noticed the minute hand jump. A man held the door open for her as she stepped into the street, a courtesy that felt like an exchange of something heavier than thanks. He wore a moving company back brace and this time carried nothing at all. In the first empty second of the elevator down to the cardiology floor, she took the letter out again. Answer the third, it tried to be ridiculous and landed somewhere else. Use the heel of your hand. The words arranged themselves in her head, the way arrhythmias arranged into patterns when you looked long enough. She had learned, over the past months, how to choose what to believe in order to do her job without dissolving. She stuck the letter into the pocket of her lab coat and let it be a superstition. She touched her pocket occasionally, the way her mother touched her wedding ring, and told herself the fact she felt better had nothing to do with it. When she came home 12 hours later, the hallway smelled like boiled rice and someone's cigarette hidden in a cupped hand out an open window. The end window carried a dusk like dust. The wall outside 4C looked the way walls do, like the skin of a patient who won't look at you. Inside, the apartment had cooled into a shape around her. Nadia set her bag down and stood very still. She didn't turn on any lights. The building's hum stepped into the room like someone who had been waiting just around a corner. The radiator clicked its measured clicks. The kitchen clock, which should have been at ease by now, gave a single, stuttering sigh. Nadia took the letter from her pocket and put it on the counter. She sat on the floor again, back to the wall, knees up, like a kid whose parent has told them to count the tiles. She waited. Footsteps, faint as a rehearsal, passed in the corridor. She forced herself not to check the peephole. She counted the beats between the steps because counting was a talent and a vice. The steps receded. She exhaled. Another set of footsteps came, closer, no attempt at stealth, the honest gait of someone carrying groceries or anger. They halted at her door. Nadia's heart performed a minor flourish in her chest, a small flourish that nurses would ignore and machines would record. The steps moved away again. She laughed once under her breath and immediately felt like she had insulted someone she couldn't afford to insult. Silence rose like water. The third set of footsteps did not come from the hall. They came from the wall to her left, inside the space where the plaster had smudged earlier. They approached, a slow, unembarrassed walk through sorcery. Nadia could tell where the person would be if the wall weren't there, could see a shape, in the way the sound rounded edges. The steps stopped beside her head. She lifted her hand. Use the heel, she whispered to herself, the way she had mouthed epinephrine in the trauma bay the first time, as if saying the word to herself was the same as summoning it. She pressed the heel of her right hand to the wall and pushed as if the wall were a chest refusing to comply. The plaster was cool, not cold, human cool, like a forehead that had finally found the right temperature. Under her palm, something responded, not a hand, not exactly, a pressure. The way two people restrained by polite surfaces might manage, a greeting. The building exhaled again. The radiator went still. From the kitchen, the clock gave a tiny sound of indecision and then settled. Nadia left her hand against the wall until the skin there felt as if it knew the paint. The footsteps, or the memory of footsteps, stepped back. The apartment felt suddenly like a dog that had chosen a spot on the floor and curled into it. When she took her hand away, she looked down at her palm out of reflex. The heel had a smear of white dust. Embedded in the dust was a hair-thin line of graphite, as if she had touched a pencil that was still writing. She washed her hands. She ate an orange over the sink. She texted her mother a picture of the kitchen window and the slice of river, and typed, "It's small, but it's mine." Her mother sent back a photograph of her father pretending to adjust a painting that had been crooked for 10 years, and typed, "We will visit. We will bring too much food." Nadia stared at the photograph longer than the joke deserved. She went into the bedroom and moved the mattress once more, because it is possible to obey a letter and still be stubborn. She took the lease out of the folder and looked again at her signature, which looked exactly like itself and also like a photograph of itself taken by a camera that did not exist. She flipped to the final page to find the tenant copy and the landlord copy. Between them, a thin sheet of carbon paper lay like a dark tongue. Nadia held it up to the light. A pale outline of letters had imprinted on it, not from her. The shapes did not match her name. They were drawn with too much pressure and too little speed, the way someone writes a name they do not use often. She could make out only one thing with certainty: the date beneath the signature. September 29th. "Before I even saw the ad," she said. The apartment made a small, tolerant sound, the way older people sometimes do when younger people protest. The inevitable. She slipped the carbon paper back where it had been. She folded the lease. She put the envelope with the letter inside. She slid the folder into the cabinet above the fridge, where people keep warranties they never read. She told herself this was a sensible woman doing ordinary things in a place that merely needed repainting. When she turned off the kitchen light and stepped into the dark, she saw a shape in the hallway mirror across from her door, the elongated oval the previous tenant had left because removing it would have meant facing the wall behind it. Her own reflection regarded her with a fierceness she recognized from call rooms and bathroom stalls at 3 a.m. The glass caught the dim and let it rest. Nadia lifted her hand to her own face in the mirror and watched herself do the same. For the smallest sliver of a second, the mirrored hand lifted a fraction too late. She stood very still and timed the breath she did not intend to take. Then she took it, because refusing nothing had ever helped anyone. The building hummed, satisfied, as if a notch had clicked into a gear. Nadia smiled at her reflection. Her reflection smiled back obediently enough. The second of lag hid itself in the room, like a moth folding into a cuff. She slept with her bed away from the vent, her head 2 feet farther from the window than was convenient. In the morning, when she left for rounds, her name had been added to the building directory in the lobby in a slightly different hand than the one she had used on the masking tape downstairs. Khan, N. The period after the N was lighter, as if someone had pressed the pen there and then changed their mind. "Welcome," Mrs. Petrov said from the door of the superintendent's office, a room that looked like it had once been a telephone closet. Nadia almost said, "You said that yesterday," and then didn't, because it occurred to her that she did not know to whom the woman had said it. As she stepped out into the street, her phone buzzed. A new message had arrived without a ringtone, without waking the screen. "Sent yesterday," the timestamp told her. "Sent at 3:17 a.m. The sender field was empty. Please put a towel along the bottom of your door tonight," the message read. "It keeps the drafts out." And then on a second line, as polite as an afterthought, and as firm as an instruction, "We're glad you're home." The first time it happened, Nadia almost didn't notice. It was her 4th night in the Belgrave, and exhaustion had become her most reliable furniture. She lay on the mattress pushed against the far wall, watching the radiator tick like an arthritic wrist, when her eyes drifted toward the wall clock in the kitchen. 17 a.m. The hands had stopped, frozen in a posture of refusal. She stared, waiting for the second hand to twitch. It didn't. The red needle hung in mid-sweep, one eyelash of movement away from the 4, the way a person holds a breath too long in an argument. Her watch on the nightstand insisted on moving. 3:18, 3:19, but in the kitchen, the clock had made its decision. Then she heard them, the footsteps. Not in the hall this time, not outside the window, but inside her apartment. They came from the living room, deliberate, heel-toe, the careful cadence of someone who did not want to wake her, but didn't care if she noticed, and layered under them. Voices, not speech exactly, but whispers, shaped like speech, the way radio static sometimes resembles words if you're desperate enough to listen. Nadia sat upright, her body moving before her brain gave permission. "Hello?" Her voice cracked. "Who's
There!" The footsteps paused. Silence stretched like taut wire. She strained her ears until they buzzed. Then softly, a whisper drifted from the kitchen. "Don't look!" Her body jerked, as if the words had been addressed directly to her. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam sliced across the living room, cutting the shadows into rectangles. Empty. The clock ticked. The red second hand swept forward as if nothing had happened.
3:20 a.m. Her watch agreed. The Belgrave had resumed its breathing. The second night she was ready. She made coffee after her shift, forcing herself to stay awake past midnight. She stacked her textbooks on the counter, highlighters fanned like surgical instruments, but she wasn't really studying, she was waiting. The kitchen clock behaved normally through the small hours, its steady tick carrying her toward the moment she dreaded. 16, she held her breath. 17, the second hand froze. The room thickened, air pressed inward like the pause before a storm takes a first step. Nadia's watch ticked obediently on, but the wall clock had no intention of following. The footsteps began again, slower this time, heavier, as if whoever walked had grown tired of pretending to be careful. She forced herself not to look away from the clock. If she moved, if she acknowledged the sound, it would win. She didn't know what it was, but her body insisted on rules it hadn't taught her brain. The whispers rose, overlapping, urgent, like people debating in another room with the door almost closed. Not ready. She signed already. 3:17? Always 3:17? Her mouth went dry. The footsteps reached the kitchen doorway. She could see nothing, only her own reflection in the microwave's black glass, pale and taut. The whispers stopped. Then one voice, close enough to feel. "Behind you." She spun. The living room was empty. When she turned back, the clock ticked again, obedient, cheerful, innocent. 3:21. Her textbooks lay open where she'd left them, highlighters waiting like patient knives. Nadia shut them and pushed them away. By the fifth night, it was no longer surprise but ritual. She would wake at 3:16 as if summoned. The clock would stall at 3:17. The world would thicken. The footsteps would come, circling her apartment with the smug rhythm of something rehearsed. The whispers would swell and scatter. Sometimes she caught fragments. Move the bed back. Not under the window, she'll see. Or why did she come here? She tried to record them. She set her phone to capture audio while she pretended to sleep, but in the morning the files contained nothing except the hum of the refrigerator. She tried writing down the words she thought she heard, but when she read them back in daylight, they looked like hallucinations. Move the bed, don't look. Behind you. Her rational mind, the part that sutured wounds and memorized drug dosages, told her this was sleep deprivation. Stress. The residue of years lived inside fluorescent hospitals. But another part of her, the part that had felt the wall breathe under her palm, knew better. The Belgrave was teaching her a new schedule, and 3:17 a.m. was its lesson. On the seventh night, she decided to fight back. She made the apartment bright, every lamp on, even the yellowed overhead fixture that flickered like an insect wing. She brewed coffee strong enough to peel the enamel off her teeth. She sat at the kitchen table with the lease folder open in front of her like a holy text. The carbon paper still bore the ghost of the earlier signature. September 29th. Whoever had signed it had known she would come. When the clock reached 3:17, she was waiting. The hands froze. "Show me," Nadia whispered. Her voice cracked, but she forced it steady. "If you're here, show me." The footsteps responded instantly, as if they'd been waiting for her challenge. They marched into the living room, crossed the floorboards with arrogant rhythm, and stopped directly behind her chair. The whispers tangled and hissed, words dissolving before they reached clarity. Nadia gripped the lease with both hands, knuckles.
White. This is my apartment, you can't. The voice cut her off, sharp and close. We already chose you. The lamps flickered. The refrigerator motor died.
Every light in the room gasped and went black. Nadia's breath turned visible in the sudden cold, and then, softly, insistently, the clock ticked forward again. 3:18, 3:19, 3:20. The light snapped back on, the refrigerator hummed, the lease folder lay closed, though she hadn't touched it. Her signature stared at her like an eye that had been open all along. Nadia stopped sleeping. She napped in the residence lounge at the hospital, lulled by the familiar beeps and buzzers. She stayed at Omar's apartment one night under the excuse of studying together, and for the first time in a week, she slept straight through 3:17. But when she returned to the Belgrave, the apartment waited with the patience of stone. The clock froze again that very night, as if offended by her absence. The footsteps came louder, the whispers closer. She pressed her hand against the plaster above the bedroom door, the spot the letter had warned her not to touch. The surface was warm, pulsing faintly like skin over a vein. The voices hushed. Then, all together, a chorus whispered from every corner of the apartment. "Don't open it!" Nadia snatched her hand back. The clock lurched forward. 3:22. She lay awake until dawn, heart hammering like she'd run 10 flights of stairs. The next evening, she tested the clock. At 2:06 a.m., she took it down from the wall and placed it in a drawer. She put her watch and her phone on the counter to check the time instead. But when 3:17 arrived, both devices froze. The second hand stopped in unison, caught in the same invisible fist, and the footsteps began again. This time, she heard them approach the bedroom door. They stopped exactly where she had touched the plaster. Whispers gathered on the other side, pressing through the wall like damp through fabric. She'll open it. She always opens it. No, not yet. Not
Yet. The drawer rattled. Nadia jolted.
The clock inside it ticked once, though she hadn't wound it, though it wasn't on the wall. One loud, solitary tick, and the whispers fell silent. The next morning, Nadia went to Mrs. Petrov. The superintendent sat in her office, sipping tea that smelled of burned cloves. The walls were lined with ledgers older than Nadia's parents. "Does this building?" Nadia began, then stopped. She didn't know how to phrase it without sounding insane. "Have you ever noticed the clocks here?"
Around 3:17?
Mrs. Petrov looked at her with eyes that had been waiting years for this question. "Ah," she said softly. "It's begun." Nadia's throat tightened. "What's begun?" The super folded her hands. "You signed, didn't you, Adia? Thought of the initials already printed, the carbon copy from September, the voice whispering, 'We already chose you.'" "Yes," she admitted. Mrs. Petrov nodded as if a debt had been confirmed. "Then you keep the schedule," she said. "The Belgrave runs on its own time, and 3:17, she sipped her tea, eyes distant, "is when the walls remember." That night, Nadia sat awake again, the clock ticking toward its inevitable pause. She told herself she would not be afraid. She told herself she was a doctor in training, rational, grounded. But when 3:17 arrived and the clock froze, she felt the apartment lean closer, like a listener bending toward a whispered secret. The footsteps started, circling, always circling. The whispers overlapped, fragments darting like fish. And then one voice rose above the others, clear and deliberate, a woman's voice this time, speaking as though through her own throat. "You're already late." The clock ticked again. 3:18, and Nadia knew the Belgrave was counting down to something she had already signed for. The first sound was laughter, not menacing laughter, not the kind horror movies plant to warn you of the knife waiting behind the curtain, but simple, domestic laughter, the warm ripple of someone enjoying a story. It came from the apartment to her right, through the thin plaster wall that separated her bedroom from the supposedly identical unit next door. Nadia sat upright in bed, her book falling closed in her lap. For one absurd second she felt relief. Relief that there was someone else here, that she wasn't as alone as the empty hallways and Mrs. Petrov's quiet warnings had suggested. But relief curdled quickly into unease, because she remembered what Mrs. Petrov had told her just days earlier, the words delivered like a funeral prayer. "You are the only tenant." Nadia held her breath and listened. The laughter carried on, joined by the murmur of another voice.
Male, deeper, too muffled to distinguish words, but unmistakably human. Then came the clink of glasses, the faint scrape of a chair leg. She swung her legs from the bed, toes curling against the cold floorboards, and leaned close to the wall.
The sounds sharpened, a conversation, a joke told and retold, the soft rustle of clothing as people shifted in their seats. She pressed her ear directly against the plaster. "We can't stay long," a woman whispered. She doesn't.
"No, yet," another answered, or maybe the same voice pitched differently.
Then laughter again, higher, louder, rolling through the wall as though the Belgrave itself was in on the joke. Nadia jerked back, heartbeat pounding in her throat. The next morning, she confronted Mrs. Petrov. "You said I was the only tenant," Nadia said, trying to sound casual but failing. "But I heard people next door talking, laughing." The superintendent gave her a look that reminded Nadia of surgeons who already knew the prognosis but wanted to see if the patient would admit it. "You are the only tenant," Mrs. Petrov repeated, her voice ironclad. "I live on the ground floor. Contractors come during the day. At night, just you." "But I heard..." Mrs. Petrov lifted one hand, palm outward, as if silencing a child. "The Belgrave is full of echoes. Don't mistake them for neighbors." Nadia wanted to argue, to demand proof, but the older woman's eyes carried a weight that smothered her words. She left the office with more questions than she had entered. That night, the sounds grew bolder. Not just laughter now, but crying, soft at first, then guttural, wrenching sobs that soaked through the wall like water through cloth. Nadia pressed her palm to the plaster, desperate to do something. Every instinct told her she was listening to a woman in real distress. "Hello?" Nadia whispered, even though she knew the wall couldn't carry her voice in the same way. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The sobs broke off instantly. Silence. Then so close to her ear it could have been inside her head. "Don't let them hear you." Nadia stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. Over the following days, the noises developed a rhythm, as though the wall itself obeyed a secret schedule. At dawn, the rattle of dishes being washed, the squeak of a faucet, a child's sleepy protest. At midday, bursts of laughter, the staccato rhythm of typewriter keys, a radio crooning faint jazz, standards that hadn't been fashionable in 60 years. At night, arguments that flared and died, sobs that refused to end, footsteps pacing, pacing, pacing. She tried to track them, scribbling notes in the margins of her textbooks. Monday, 2:14 a.m., lullaby, humming, unfamiliar language. Wednesday, 5:02 a.m., man laughing, but stopped mid-breath. Friday, 3:17 a.m., overlap with the frozen clock, voices louder than usual couldn't make out words. Her notes filled pages, a second education layered over her medical training. One evening, determined not to spend another night simply listening, Nadia knocked on the door of the apartment next to hers. The number plate read 6B, tarnished brass dulled to green by age. She knocked once, twice, 3 times. Silence. She pressed her ear to the door. Nothing. No breath. No shuffle. Not even the building's usual groan. But when she stepped back, the faintest shadow rippled under the crack at the threshold, like feet moving away. She rattled the handle. Locked. Her pulse slowed reluctantly as she retreated. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe fatigue was building entire lives inside plaster and wood. But that night, when the voices resumed, They weren't muffled. They were right against her bedroom wall. She was at the door, one whispered. But she shouldn't knock.
Again, another replied. And then laughter. This time, Nadia didn't just feel afraid. She felt mocked. By the second week, the voices invaded her dreams. She dreamed of sitting at her kitchen table while invisible neighbors dined just out
Of sight, their cutlery scraping plates she could not see. She dreamed of standing in the shower while someone on the other side wept, her sobs echoing louder than the water. She dreamed of children giggling under her bed, their small hands brushing her ankles when she dared look down, and always the clock froze at 3:17. On one such night, caught between dream and waking, Nadia heard her name whispered, not once, dozens of times, hundreds, each voice overlapping, a chorus of unseen tenants chanting, Nadia, 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 until her ears rang. She sat up in bed gasping. The clock ticked again. 3:20, the whispers stopped. She decided she needed proof. Borrowing a stethoscope from the hospital's supply room, she pressed its cold disc against the plaster wall the next evening. The sounds bloomed in her ears with horrifying clarity. Laughter, weeping, a man humming tunelessly, a baby's wail. She slid the stethoscope down the wall across the floorboards, even to the ceiling. Every surface revealed its own occupant. Voices lived not just beside her, but above, below, around, as though the entire Belgrave carried the imprint of lives that no longer existed. She yanked the stethoscope out of her ears, trembling. 2 nights later, she woke to silence, no laughter, no crying, not even footsteps. The stillness pressed so heavily she could hear her own heartbeat. Then 3 knocks on her wall. Measured, polite, expectant. She sat frozen, pulse rattling her ribs. The knocks came again. This time, a voice accompanied them, female, familiar, in a way that made her skin crawl. Nadia, let us in. Her breath caught. She hadn't told anyone her name. Not even Mrs. Petrov had called her anything but tenant. We're so lonely here, the voice continued.
And you've already signed. The knocks became pounding, the plaster trembled, dust sifted from the ceiling. Then, just as suddenly, silence. The clock ticked forward. 3:22. The next morning, Nadia confronted Mrs. Petrov again. I hear them,
Nadia said, voice shaking with exhaustion. Neighbors, talking, laughing, crying. They knock on my wall, they know my name. Don't tell me they don't exist. The superintendent studied her for a long, brittle silence. Then, with something almost like pity, she answered, they existed once. Nadia's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Mrs. Petrov sipped her tea, her hands steady. The Belgrave remembers its tenants, every laugh, every cry, every secret. The walls are saturated. Sometimes the building plays them back. Sometimes... She trailed off, her gaze slipping towards the hallway. Sometimes it wants you to join the chorus. Nadia felt her knees weaken. Join! Mrs. Petrov fixed her with eyes like old glass. You already signed, child. It isn't a lease, it's permission. That night, the voices were waiting. They didn't whisper. They didn't laugh. They sang. A wordless hymn, layered and endless, voices of men and women and children woven together in a melody that felt older than language. Nadia pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound pulsed through bone and blood. The gig hymn swelled, louder, until she could make out words hidden in its rhythm. Room for one more. Room for one more. Room for one more. She staggered toward the door, desperate to leave, but when she reached for the knob, her hand froze. The air around her thickened. The clock on the kitchen wall was stuck again. 3:17. Her apartment was full of voices, full of neighbors who had no bodies, full of lives replaying themselves on an endless loop. And somewhere deep in the plaster, louder than the rest, one voice whispered clearly, "Don't resist, you live here now, with us!" The clock ticked forward. 3:18, the hymn cut off like a throat slashed, and Nadia collapsed onto her bed, clutching her ears as silence once again claimed the Belgrave. The mirror appeared on a Tuesday. Not that it hadn't been there before. Its frame had hung opposite Nadia's door since the day she moved in, half veiled by a sheet of plastic the contractors never bothered to remove. But that Tuesday, it was suddenly present, as if the building had rotated a degree and light now struck it at the right angle to wake it. It was taller than she'd realized. Floor to ceiling, set into the wall rather than hung on it, the way houses in old movies had mirrors that were really doors if you knew the trick. The frame was carved with acanthus leaves, their edges smoothed by dozens of paint jobs and a century of fingers. Beneath the paint, she could make out faint cuts and initials. BG192. The last digit had been swallowed by a crack, like a year that refused to finish becoming itself. She noticed it after laundry. Her arms were full of warm towels, her cheek pressed to the top of the stack, when movement in her peripheral vision tugged her head around. The hall was empty. Still, something in the glass had shifted. She set the towels on the floor and stepped closer. Her reflection stepped closer too, but out of sync, as if they were partners in a dance whose rhythm they hadn't agreed on. She raised her right hand and waved. The woman in the mirror didn't wave back. 4 heartbeats later, she did. Nadia grabbed her towels and retreated into the safety of her apartment, slamming the deadbolt with the blunt confidence of a medieval drawbridge. For the rest of the night, she convinced herself that fatigue had finally bent her perception out of true, that any mirror would misbehave given enough shadow. But the next morning, she tested it with purpose. She opened the door a crack and peered into the hall. Dust motes jittered in the chalky light. She stepped out and stood before the glass. If she raised her eyebrow, the reflection followed. Counting under her breath, she measured a 2-second lag, maybe 3. She tried again with exaggerated gestures, hands out, hands down. The lag persisted, steady as a metronome. "Okay," she whispered. "You're late. I can work with late." She had grown up with a scientist's brain, the kind that wanted patterns more than it wanted comfort. That afternoon, she filled a page of her notebook with times and observations. Lag 2.8. Lighting inside mirror looks warmer. Hall sconces. Glow amber V are fluorescent. My hoodie logo reads left to right. Mirror should flip. This doesn't. That last note made her stop, pen suspended over paper. She looked again. The logo on her sweatshirt, Sahara Cafe, curved around a little sun, read correctly in the glass. Not reversed, as if the mirror didn't reflect at all, but presented an image of her from somewhere that obeyed a different rule about words. She stood so close, her breath fogged the surface. Her reflection fogged it too, after the delay, and the twin blossoms of condensation merged into a single, imperfect ellipse. Nadia wrote HI with her fingertip. In the mirror, the letters smeared. Then late, the other Nadia wrote HI back in exactly the same place, the same pressure, the same hesitation on the downward stroke of the H. Nadia felt an impulse to laugh, then to cry. The feeling passed through her like weather. For the rest of the day, she told herself it was a trick of old glass. For the rest of the week, she did not believe herself. The clock stopped every night at 3:17 a.m. She had begun to sit upright when it happened, waiting for the footsteps and whispers, as one waits for a bruise to bloom. But now there was a new ritual. During those frozen seconds, the mirror across the hall cleared its throat. On the third night after she noticed the lag, she opened her door at 3:15, barefoot, cardigan thrown over pajamas, and took her station in front of the glass. When the clock inside her apartment ceased at 3:17, the time in the hall thinned. Sounds went away. The buzz of the fluorescent, the refrigerator's mechanical breath. Even the building's bones stopped shifting. And then something like radio static rustled through the silvered backing of the mirror, very soft, the way a shell tells you a story about the sea. She lifted her hand, the other Nadia lifted hers, late as usual. But when Nadia dropped her arm, the reflection did not. It stood there with its hand still raised, an instruction forgotten or ignored. Nadia's throat went tight. She raised both hands this time and then lowered one. The mirror matched and then, after a heartbeat too long, did something else. Her reflection adjusted the cuff of its cardigan with a quick, habitual gesture that Nadia recognized from her
own fidgeting, except she hadn't done it. "Don't," she said aloud.
Her voice sounded like it belonged to the building, not to her. "Don't improvise." The reflection smiled nervously. Nadia felt her cheeks bare and still. She did not smile back. When the clock inside ticked forward to 3:18 and the world started again, the mirror snapped back into obedience, if obedience meant lag. By 3:19 they were synchronized in their wrongness again. Nadia closed the door gently, like the lid of a box that didn't quite fit its contents, and leaned her forehead against the wood until splinters printed her skin. Her notes for that night were sharper, the pen cuts deeper. 3:17, 3:18. Reflection autonomous. Moves independent of me, smiles, touched sleeve. Possible seizure of time localized to apartment hall. Mirror space persists through pause. She fell asleep with the notebook open on her chest. When she woke at dawn, there was a small smudge of ink on her collarbone, like someone had touched her with a wet thumb. Autonomy, she discovered, bred boldness. The next night, the mirror's lag grew to 5 seconds. By Friday, 7. Between 3:17 and 3:18, the reflection had a full minute of agency that bled into the edges like watercolor. It used the time efficiently. At exactly 3:17:01, the reflection took a step toward the glass and pressed its palm flat.
Nadia could not tell if it was asking for contact or testing the thickness of the world. She lifted her own hand in answer, and for 7 seconds they were not aligned. Then the mirror caught up. The copy's palm slid under hers, and something
like cold passed through Nadia's bones, as if she'd reached into a snowdrift to rescue a lost key. On Saturday, the reflection looked over Nadia's shoulder, not the way a mirror self pretends to look over your shoulder by looking over its own, but as if the geometry had shifted and it could see around her into the interstitial spaces of the hall. It squinted, the way Nadia did, without contacts, and then flinched. Nadia knew the look of recognition in her own face. Something had moved that she did not want to know. "Do you see them?"
Nadia whispered. The reflection mouthed something, late and imperfect, and then shook its head with a quick, terrified emphasis that meant not now. Behind Nadia, the corridor was empty. Behind the reflection, shadows threaded the amber light like
fish schooling in a current, far away and very close. On Sunday, something else changed. The other Nadia wore an earring. Nadia lifted her fingers to her own lobe and felt skin bare. She hadn't worn earrings since the semester she scrubbed in and took them out for good. Her reflection hadn't either, until it had. The earring was a small silver hoop with a charm she recognized, a tiny enamel sun, the same as the logo on her hoodie. "Where did you get that?" she asked, as if the reflection could answer in speech as well as mimicry. The reflection touched the charm, lightly, then looked at her with an expression that made Nadia dizzy with pity. It looked like a woman about to lie. She tried to show it kindness. It felt deranged, like befriending a character in a story you could not stop reading. But the building had been greedy for her attention, and if she did not direct the hunger, it would feed where it pleased. On Monday, she wrote, "Who are you?" on a sheet of paper and held it up at 3:17. The reflection did the same 7 seconds later, the letters crisp and legible, but when Nadia lowered her paper, the other Nadia didn't. Instead, it flipped the page and wrote something new on the reverse. Backward. Nadia squinted and sounded it out like a child learning to read. in a foreign alphabet. "Don't knock." She felt the words like a hand on her shoulder. She had knocked on 6B. She had knocked loudly. She nodded once. The reflection nodded later, relief softening its mouth. The next night, Nadia asked, "Is it safe to leave?" and received, after the time stitched itself closed, "Not now," and watched the clock. On the third night, the reflection held up a sheet before. Nadia could show hers, the lines trembling as if the writer had been rushed or afraid. Some voices are recordings, some aren't. She pressed her lips together until they steadied.
"Who made you?" she whispered into the cold seam of 317. The reflection shook its head. It placed a palm over its own heart, as if pledging allegiance, and then flattened its other hand against the glass again. Nadia mirrored the posture.
Warmth passed between them despite the cold, or maybe the warmth was only the heat of her shame. She was ashamed it comforted her. It escalated the way storms do, slowly, then all at once. On Thursday, the lag hit 12 seconds. She began to have the disorienting sensation that she was sometimes the copy, that she'd already done a thing and was doing it again. When she brushed a crumb from her sweater, the reflection did it in an improved way, the gesture cleaner, more efficient, like someone had edited her into a better version. On Friday, during the 317 pause, the mirror hall brightened, and at the far end, past the staircase that had been blocked for months by caution tape, a door opened. People crossed the threshold carrying bags and coats. The reflection turned its head as if listening to a favorite song. Nadia could hear nothing. She could only watch as her other self took a step backward toward the incoming tide of silhouettes. A hand braced over the charm at her ear as if it ached. "Nadia," said a voice to her left. She jerked. It was not the mirror. It was the wall. Or, no, it was the word rising through the wall like air through a straw. "Nadia," the wall breathed again. "Come back to bed." Her skin crawled. She did not turn. She looked at the mirror. The other Nadia's jaw tightened. It shook its head, tiny, frantic gestures, and wrote on its page with quick, broken strokes. "Not me," the voice from the wall grew playful. "You're not sleeping," it sang softly. "You never sleep. Come lie down. I'll tell you a story about a girl who looked at a mirror too long." Nadia swallowed. Her throat clicked audibly. She kept her eyes on the glass. "Later," she said to the wall. "That wasn't one. I'm busy." The almost laugh that came through plaster was too close to her own voice for comfort. The clock ticked to 3:18. The hall dimmed. The door at the far end of the reflected corridor clicked shut. When the building breathed again, the mirror's surface was only silver and her face in it like a question. The next day, she asked Mrs. Petrov about the mirror in the hallway. "The glass?" the superintendent said without looking up from her crossword. "It came with the bones." "Do you know whose idea?" "Everyone's idea," Mrs. Petrov said. She filled in a word with the stub of a pencil. "You put a looking glass at a threshold to keep a thing from fully crossing. It is polite architecture." "Polite," Nadia repeated. "A mirror eats and returns. Better it eats what's meant for us than lets it through." Mrs. Petrov lifted her gaze. "Do you understand?" Nadia thought of the other Nadia's earring. She thought of the charm like a small sun inside a winter. "I don't know what I understand." "That is also polite," the superintendent said. "Don't stare too long. It likes to be admired. It doesn't like to be needed." "What happens if I need it?" Nadia asked. Mrs. Petrov folded her crossword. "Then it will give you exactly what you ask for, child, which is the worst kind of gift." That night, Nadia did not go to the mirror. She sat cross-legged on her bed with the lease on her lap and reread the section with her signature, dated 3 weeks before she'd called the number on the listing. The signature looked like hers. It felt like hers in the wrist when she traced the strokes in the air, but something in the spell of it was wrong. You could know a thing with your bones and still not have language for it. You signed permission to be needed, she thought, and felt dizzy. At 3:16 she turned out her lamps. At 3:17 she stayed in bed and listened. The footsteps were gentle tonight, as if someone had taken their shoes off to be kind. The voices were low and even, like a conversation held in the next room by people who loved each other. She might have fallen asleep if not for the sensation of being watched. No, seen through, as if something counted her breaths for inventory. The feeling strengthened, an invisible weight on her chest. She sat up. The air in the room hummed like a string placed between teeth and plucked. Very slowly, without turning on a light, she opened her door and stepped into the hall. The mirror's surface shone like water, without Nadia there to prompt it. The reflection had done what it wanted to do. The other hall bustled. Men in suspenders moved furniture. A woman with her hair pinned in a style that belonged to a decade you could name if you had ever studied. Photographs did not look at Nadia, but at some invisible partner. Down the corridor, a child ran with a paper airplane, its nose bent from too many crashes. Everything was quiet, the way television is quiet behind thick glass. And near the mirror, her other self waited. She stood with her hands in the pockets of her cardigan like she had all the time in the world. When Nadia approached, she pulled a single page from somewhere, the pocket, a fold in the air, and pressed it to the inside of the glass. The paper slicked to the surface like skin. Nadia put her own hand against it without thinking, palm to palm, page between, and felt a tingling as soft as breath. Letters formed on the page. Not the backward scrawl of the last few nights, but forward text, printed neatly in a hand, so much like her own, it made her stomach turn. Tomorrow, 2:41 p.m., don't take the stairs. Nadia's mouth went dry. Why? The other Nadia widened her eyes and made a small shape with her lips that was either please or please's ghost. She tapped the paper twice with one finger. Tomorrow. And then the mirror hummed. The amber lights behind her flickered, and the reflection pulled the page away, as if it might stick to this side if she waited. The clock inside Nadia's apartment ticked forward. She stood for a long time in the hall, cold reaching her toes through the old wood, and then went inside and locked the door. The paper was not in her hand. Her palm held only the memory of pressure. In the morning, she found a note slid under her door. Cheap white printer paper. Her name on the outside written in a hand that was not quite hers, the way a mirror remembers a face but forgets a scar. Inside, a single sentence. Tomorrow, 2:41 p.m. Don't take the stairs. Her stomach dropped as if she had, in the moment of reading, descended too fast. The first letter came on a Monday. Nadia almost didn't see it, just a white envelope pushed halfway under her apartment door. She assumed it was a flyer, another pizza coupon from some place that didn't deliver this far. She bent down, tugged it free, and froze. Her name was written on the front. Nadia. The handwriting was her own. She turned the envelope over, no stamp, no return address. The flap wasn't even sealed. With her pulse drumming, she slid the paper free. It was one sheet. The words were neat, familiar. Tuesday, 9:15 am, you'll spill your coffee on the counter, curse, and wipe it with the red towel. Don't panic. Nadia's fingers went cold. She read the sentence 3 times. Every curve of the letters was hers, her peculiar way of slanting the T, the looped D in don't. She dropped the letter on the kitchen table, backed away as if it might burn her, and stood with her arms pressed tight against her ribs. Her first thought, prank. Someone had found her notebooks, practiced her handwriting, but no one came into this apartment. She barely let Mrs. Petrov, the building superintendent, pass the threshold. The second thought, the mirror, the reflection, the warning it had given about the stairs. She left the letter on the table. The next morning, she deliberately ignored it. She brewed coffee, humming tunelessly, pretending nothing was wrong. But at 9:15, the mug slipped from her hand and splashed across the counter.
Hot liquid soaked her wrist, ran down the wood. She cursed out loud.
Instinctively, she grabbed the nearest towel, the red one with the faded stripe, and wiped it clean. Then she froze, towel midair, exactly as the letter had said. The second letter arrived Tuesday night. Same envelope, same handwriting. She tore it open with shaking fingers. Wednesday, 3:05 p.m. You'll look through the peephole. No one will be there. Step back. Do not open the door. Nadia pressed the paper flat to the table. Her hands were slick. She wanted to throw it in the trash, but she couldn't stop reading the words over and over, her own writing, her own voice, echoing from tomorrow. All night she lay awake, the clock ticking toward 3:17 a.m., dreading the frozen silence that came with it. When it arrived, the hallway mirror flickered to life, amber light humming behind her reflection. The other Nadia stood there, pale and strained, a note already in her hand. "Did you get it?" Nadia nodded. She whispered, "The peephole."
Tomorrow. What's there? The reflection pressed a finger to its lips. The gesture was sharp, urgent.
Then the lights in the mirror world went out, and the clock ticked on. The next day, at exactly 3:05, someone knocked. Nadia sat in her chair, rigid, watching the door. Knock. Knock. She forced herself up, every step like walking through mud, her chest squeezed tight as she put her eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty. Her breath fogged the glass. She stumbled back, remembering the words, "Do not open." The knock came again, louder this time. Then a voice, soft and pleading, "Please, please open. You dropped your keys." Her body screamed to move, to unlock the door, to obey the logic.
Kindness. But the letter, her own handwriting, burned in her memory.
She pressed herself flat against the wall, covering her ears. The knocking faded. The silence that replaced it was worse. By Thursday, the letters were routine. One each night slid under her door before dawn. Each predicted something. Some were harmless. Thursday, 10:40 a.m. You'll drop your spoon, pick it up. Nothing follows. Others curdled her stomach. Friday, 7:22 p.m. You'll hear the neighbor laugh. You don't have neighbors. Stay away from the wall, and one chilled her, deeper than any. Saturday, 12 p.m. Don't look in the mirror. Don't trust what it shows. She stacked the envelopes in a drawer, unable to throw them out. Each one came true. Each one pinned her to a track she hadn't chosen. It was like living inside a script someone else had written. Saturday arrived with rain. Nadia tried not to think about the mirror warning, but at 1:59 she found herself standing at her apartment door, staring down the hall. The mirror glowed faintly in the dim. Her reflection lingered inside it, but not in sync, not waiting for her. It was already standing still, hands folded, expression grave. She felt the pull to look, to step forward. At exactly 2 p.m, a whisper threaded the hall. "Nadia!" Her reflection's mouth moved with the sound. The voice was hers. Her stomach dropped. She clenched her fists, forced herself to shut the door. She stayed inside, rocking in her chair until her pulse steadied. When she looked again an hour later, the hallway was empty. The letters escalated after that. They stopped predicting accidents and began giving instructions. Sunday, 11:11 a.m. Leave the kettle unplugged. Don't ask why. Monday, 4:55 p.m. Do not answer your phone. Tuesday, 8:03 p.m. When you hear your name whispered from the bathroom, say nothing. Each note carried her own handwriting, her own phrasing. Each demanded obedience, and every time she followed, she felt herself slip deeper into a pattern she couldn't see. At night, in the 3:17 silence, her reflection nodded approval. Sometimes it pressed its hand to the glass, as if to remind her they were allies. Sometimes it mouthed words Nadia couldn't quite read, as though the glass was thickening between them. But one night, a new page appeared, slid under her door. Early, before midnight, she tore it open, trembling. Wednesday, 2:41 p.m. "Don't take the stairs," Nadia gasped. The words were identical to the warning she had already received from the reflection in Chapter 4. Same phrasing, same time, same
handwriting. The script was circling.
repeating itself, and the question burned her throat like acid. If she was writing these letters from her own future, when would she finally be the one holding the pen? The first time Nadia noticed the new door, she thought it was her eyes playing tricks in the dim hallway light. It stood between apartments 3A and 3B, where there had always been a blank stretch of wallpapered wall. Now, overnight, a door was there, narrow, painted the same pale grey as the rest of the building, but unmistakably real. Brass number plate gleaming, Eschwast room 0. Nadia froze with her grocery bag biting into her wrist. She stared until her vision blurred, waiting for the wall to settle back into what it should have been. But the door didn't vanish. It just stood there, humming with quiet wrongness. She thought about knocking on Mrs. Petrov's office, but something held her back. Some instinct that told her naming it would make it stronger. That night, as the clock neared 3:17, she sat upright in bed, staring at the faint strip of hallway light under her door. And when the second hand froze, she heard it, the squeak of brass turning in a socket, the sound of room 0's handle shifting on its own. The next morning, Nadia asked anyway. She cornered Mrs. Petrov while the woman was sweeping the lobby, her scarf tied tight under her chin. "There's a door on the 3rd floor, between 3A and 3B. Petrov's broom froze mid-sweep. Her knuckles whitened on the handle. "There's no such door. I saw it last night. It's there." The older woman's lips thinned, her eyes sliding away. "The building is old, walls warp. You think you see things, better to ignore." Nadia felt her throat go dry. "So, you know what I'm talking about?" "I know," Petrov snapped too quickly. Then she softened, lowering her voice. "Some doors are not for tenants. Some doors belong to the building. Stay out." And she walked away, broom clattering. That night, Nadia lingered in the hall longer than she meant to. The new door looked even worse in the half-light, too tall, too narrow, as if it had been stretched by something trying to make it fit. The brass number 0 gleamed in the faint glow of the exit sign. She ran her fingers an inch from the surface. Cold, too cold. From
inside came a faint noise, not voices, not exactly, a shuffling, a dragging.
Like someone pacing in a tiny space, waiting to be let out. Nadia stumbled back into her apartment, locking the door twice, 3 times. When 3:17 came, the frozen silence pressed against her like always. But this time, layered beneath it, she heard the brass knob rattle, slow at first, then faster, as though something on the other side had grown impatient. By the 4th night, the letters returned. The envelope slid under her door just after midnight. Her handwriting, steady as always. Thursday, 3:17 am. Wendy.
"Room 0 opens, don't look inside. Whatever you do, don't count the people." Nadia's stomach lurched.
She tore the paper in half, then into quarters, then into shreds, but the words burned behind her eyes. "Don't count the people." At 3:17, she pressed her ear to her own door, heart hammering. Silence deepened until her pulse was the loudest thing in the world. Then the click. The door handle turning. The hinges groaning. The hallway filled with the sound of footsteps. Dozens of them. Bare feet, dragging soles, uneven shuffles. They passed her apartment, moving in unison, an impossible parade. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. When the clock ticked again, when sound returned, the hallway was empty. But the smell lingered, stale air, mildew, and something older, something that hadn't left that room in years. Nadia tried to avoid the third floor after that. She took the stairs two at a time, eyes down, pretending the space between 3A and 3B didn't exist. But she couldn't help noticing how the door changed. Some nights it looked brand new, paint smooth, brass shining. Other nights it was cracked and peeling, as though it had stood untouched for decades. Once she saw it standing open a fraction of an inch, and though every cell in her body screamed at her not to look, she looked anyway. Just darkness. Not a normal darkness, but the kind that had depth, the kind that pulled. She slammed her own door and wept into her hands. Friday, another letter. Friday, 11:59 p.m. Room 0 will move. Don't lose track. Her skin prickled as she read it. She crept to the peephole, staring at the familiar hallway. Room 0 stood still between 3A and 3B, unmoving until it wasn't. At 12:03, the brass handle blurred. The outline of the door seemed to flicker like bad film stock, and suddenly it wasn't there. Just blank wall again. She gasped and stumbled back. She checked again minutes later. The door had shifted down the hall, now wedged between 3C and 3D. Her heart pounded. The room was moving, sliding itself along the hall like a chess piece, waiting for someone to notice. By Sunday, Nadia stopped sleeping. Every time she closed
her eyes, she dreamed of walking through that door, of counting,
of seeing faces that didn't belong to anyone alive. The letters kept coming. Sunday, 3:17, they will knock. Do not knock back. Monday, 2:41, room 0 will call you by name. Ignore it. Tuesday, you will want to open it. That's how it takes. You, each one in her handwriting. Each one pushing her deeper into obedience. But the more she obeyed, the more room 0 lingered outside her awareness, creeping closer, bending the rules of the building. One dawn, she opened her apartment door
and nearly screamed. Room 0 was there, directly across from her apartment.
Door number 0 staring her down like an eye. The brass handle twitched once, twice, and then it began to turn. The brass knob across the hall twitched once, twice, and Nadia thought she might faint. She pressed her forehead against the cool wood of her own apartment door, waiting for the click that would signal room 0 was opening. But it didn't come. Instead, silence deepened like a weight pressing down, until the tick of the hallway clock froze at exactly 3:17 a.m. and the world stopped moving. The first time the clock froze, she'd thought it was just her mind playing tricks. By now, she recognized the terrible truth. These seconds weren't empty at all. They belonged to something else. Her breath puffed out in white clouds, though the radiator hummed warm behind her. The air turned sharp, metallic, as if it had been pulled from the lungs of a tomb. And then she heard it. Footsteps. But not in the hall this time. Inside her apartment. She spun around, heart pounding against her ribs. The living room lamp glowed. Faintly, but shadows stretched wrong, bending away from the corners. A figure stood by the kitchen counter. It wasn't there a moment ago. It didn't move. Neither did she. Then came the whisper, brittle and papery, as though carried through the
folds of centuries. She's almost ready. Nadia's stomach dropped.
She couldn't even scream. The air refused to carry her voice. The figure shifted an inch only when the clock remained frozen. It had no face, just the blur of one, as though erased from memory. Its arms were too long. Its hands twitched toward the walls. Another whisper slithered from the bedroom doorway. Not yet. Soon. Nadia's throat burned. She turned slowly, and there, in the dim spill of lamplight, another figure hunched by the window. Its body was skeletal, ribs pressing against translucent skin that glowed faintly, like parchment lit from behind. It pressed its face. No, not a face, just a smooth blank surface, against the glass, as if watching something outside that wasn't there. She backed away until her legs hit the couch. The clock still hadn't moved. Frozen time stretched, elastic, unbearable, and then from the kitchen, the first figure whispered again, "Closer now, she hears us." Nadia clamped her hands over her ears, but the voice wasn't in the air, it was inside her skull. Her body trembled violently. She darted for the door, twisting the locks, but as her fingers brushed cold brass, the knob turned on its own, slowly, steadily. Not hers. The door creaked open an inch, then another. Beyond was not the hallway. Beyond was blackness. A third whisper crawled out from the dark. Almost ready, she slammed the door shut and stumbled back, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The tick of the clock returned. Sound rushed back into the room, the hum of the radiator, the distant buzz of the exit light in the hall. The figures were gone. Nadia collapsed onto the floor, sobbing into her palms. She stayed there until morning, knees pulled to her chest, watching shadows creep across the floor as the sun rose. By daylight, the apartment looked normal again. The couch, the kitchen counter, the radiator clanking, but she knew the truth. Normal was only a mask. The next night she tried to fight it. She unplugged the wall clock. She shut herself in the bathroom, radio blaring static, loud enough to rattle the mirror. She stared at her own reflection until her eyes watered, whispering, "It won't happen. It won't happen." But at 3:17 a.m. the second hand of her wristwatch froze and the radio went silent, mid-hiss. When she blinked, they were already there. One sat cross-legged on the bathroom counter, head cocked sideways like a curious child. Another crouched in the tub, fingers scraping faint grooves into porcelain. They didn't move while she watched, only when she turned her head, only when she blinked. Her reflection in the mirror lagged again, only this time the lag wasn't seconds, it was minutes. The reflection watched her, shaking its head slowly, lips forming words she couldn't hear. Behind her, the figure in the tub whispered, "Don't fight it, she's almost ready." Nadia screamed, but no sound came out. She stopped sleeping after that. The whispers had followed her into every room, filling the frozen seconds. She could no longer tell whether her body kept living during the pauses or if she only existed inside them. One dawn, she found scratches on her wrists, thin, shallow lines as though drawn there by absent-minded fingers. She didn't remember making them. On the kitchen table sat another envelope, her handwriting again. Wednesday, 17. Don't let them touch you. If they touch you, it's over. Her hands shook so hard she dropped the letter into her tea. The ink bled, smearing until the words melted into one another. But she understood. They weren't just waiting, they were preparing her. For what she didn't dare imagine. The worst came on Thursday. She sat cross-legged in her bed, knife clutched, in both hands, determined to survive the frozen stretch. When the clock stopped, the air thickened. The figures arrived in silence, slipping into the room through walls that rippled faintly like water. 5 of them now, maybe more. One knelt at the foot of her bed. One pressed against the ceiling like a spider. One leaned close enough that she felt the cold absence of breath on her face. And they whispered, in unison this time. "She's almost ready." The knife slipped from her hands, and her reflection in the darkened window opened its mouth and whispered with them. Nadia didn't leave the apartment in daylight anymore. Daylight pretended everything was normal. Mailboxes with brass numbers, stair treads that complained in familiar ways, the building manager's thumb-smudged notices about radiator bleeding and recycling etiquette. Daylight was a liar. Night had stopped pretending. On the 5th night, after the figures first spoke in unison, she woke at 3:14 a.m. and sat on the floor with her back against the couch, knees to her chest, a notebook open on the coffee table. She had filled 3 notebooks with what she'd started calling the rules of the building, Fragments, patterns, scraps of cause and effect that might not be cause or effect at all. She wrote with her left hand now, the right shook too badly. When the hour approached, 3:17 is the seam. Seam opens when you look away. They move inside the seam. Letters predict actions. Letters lie less than clocks. Do not let them touch me. She underlined the last rule twice, dug the point of her pencil into the paper until it snapped. A white envelope lay beside the notebook, her name in her own hand across the front. Nadia Derin. It had arrived during dinner, slid under the door the way they always did. She had left it sealed until now because she was afraid of what it would say, and because she was more afraid it would say nothing at all. She peeled the seal with careful, shaking fingers and unfolded the single page. Friday, you will try to leave. Take only what you can carry and go down the stairs at 3:16. Do not look at the mirror. If you look, you won't make it to the street. If you don't make it to the street, you will be rewritten. You are already being rewritten. Her own handwriting, the curve of the N, the impatient hook at the Y, the tiny cut where the cheap pen had snagged. She touched the paper as if she could warm it through contact. Leave at 3:16, do not look.
At the mirror. Her eyes lifted, almost against her will, to the mirror across the hall.
It stood where it had always stood, opposite her doorway. A rectangle of tarnished silver in a walnut frame with carved rosettes at the corners. It had been an antique when the building was new. It had watched 100 people leave for work, return with groceries, fight in whispers, flirt with neighbors they would not see again. It watched her now, the surface calm as a lake with a storm beneath. "Don't look," she whispered, and shoved the letter into her coat pocket. She put on her boots, her coat, slung a canvas bag across her shoulder, wallet, keys, a water bottle, the last notebook. She slipped the others into the oven and turned the dial as high as it would go, watched the covers curl and blacken behind the glass until the titles she had written on their spines, Lease, Voices, Mirror, were little more than ash smears. Her hand lingered on the oven knob. "I am leaving." She said it aloud once to hear the sound of it, to try it on like a garment she wanted to believe fit. "I am leaving now. I will leave." She checked the locks, turned them, and stood with her palm against the door, feeling the faint tremble running through the wood the way a sleeper might feel a train passing miles outside the city. 15. She opened the door and stepped into the hall. The tile against her soles felt slightly warm, as if someone had walked here moments before. The hall smelled faintly of lemon oil and the industrial cleaner the manager used on the banister. The exit sign at the far end glowed an unhealthy green, the A flickering with a nervous twitch. She kept her eyes away from the mirror. She focused on the far fire door, the metal plate scuffed by decades of shoes, the push bar that had squealed when she'd first moved in and now made that sound only sometimes. She counted steps. She'd measured them before. 39 to the stairs, then 2 flights down, then the front door that stuck in summer. 3:16, her heart climbed into her throat. She walked, her bag thumped against her spine. The door frames drifted past in their numbered order. 3A, 3B, a blank gap where 3C had never been. The gap where room zero's hand turned slow as breathing in the small hours. She kept her gaze glued to the floor. She knew precisely where the mirror's walnut frame would be in her periphery and refused to give it the fraction of a glance that would open the world wide open. 10 paces, 20, 25. The radiator clicked so sound, a domestic sound. Her shoulders tried to turn toward it. She forced them forward. 33. Her boots fire-warm like a motor that had spun so long it had become its own purpose. She twisted. The door swung inward on no hinges she could see. Room 0 was not a room. It was a distance. It was the exact width of a second stretch to a corridor, lit by a light that made no shadows but somehow turned shapes into ideas of shapes. It smelled like paper that had absorbed a century and then been breathed on. It sounded like her name said in a mouth that knew her before she did. At the far end, if far had meaning here, a smaller door waited. It was round, a porthole where the corridor expected a keyhole, a black circle rimmed in nickel like an old elevator. The glass in its center was silvered on one side. On the other side, it was clear. At first, the glass showed only darkness. Then a face rose in it like something surfacing from deep water. Her face, or the face she wore here, pale, eyes too wide, hair clinging to her temples. Nadia reached for the glass, then stopped. She had touched too many wrong things already. The mirror? Nadia didn't hesitate. She lifted her hand and pressed her palm to the other side of the circle, slow, pleading, so that Nadia could see every line in the print, could feel the ache of wanting to meet it. Words formed in mirror Nadia's mouth. Nadia read them the way a person reads lips in a noiseless theater scene, grasping at shape and guesswork. "Let me out." Nadia shook her head. That's what she would say if positions were reversed. That's what anyone would say. She tried to form "I'm here" with her lips, but the second had its own script. The corridor fluttered, the building shifted, a deep, structural exhale. The not bodies, her visitors, her neighbors, her future, were here with her. In the seam, they had shapes and they were attentive, not hungry, not cruel, like docents guiding a museum or hands arranging a place setting. They are making room. The part of her brain that had been writing letters for weeks thought, "They are making room for me." "Not me," Nadia said aloud. "I won't." The corridor answered by offering her a memory. Her first day. The lease.
On the cheap laminate desk. The page waiting with her signature already there. The relief so deep it felt like falling onto a mattress you can't see. I am allowed to have something. I am allowed to live.
She had thought the building was older than she was, that it had seen better and worse and wasn't inclined to argue. She had thought the city had forgotten it. She had thought she could be forgotten here, safely. The second memory slid behind, the first like a transparency. The first night when the wall clock paused and the quiet had density. The whisper, "She's almost ready." The way she had told herself she misheard pipes. The third, the envelopes, her own careful capitals. She had imagined looped time as a kindness, tomorrow sending a line backward to today, giving advice, passing a note under the desk before the test. But the test had always been whether she could move while the second stopped, whether she could consent to the consent she had already signed. "You can keep the second," she said to the corridor. "You can keep the mirror, the clock, not me." The not bodies moved, not closer, not away. They arranged themselves along the corridor, in a pattern that made Nadia think of photographs taken long ago, when families posed with stiff patience because shutters were slow. They left a path. To the porthole door, to the circle with its two faces, her face on the other side, lifted its chin a fraction and mouthed again, more urgently, "Please." The mirror version's palm flattened to the glass and Nadia could see ridges, whorls, scars she recognized. A ring of skin slightly shiny where a burn had healed from a kitchen accident 3 apartments ago. The half-moon of a cut made by keys in a hurry. Everything about the hand was hers. Everything about its plea felt like a line from a letter she had not yet written. "If they touch you, it's over," she had written to herself. "If they touch you..." Fingers, absent, cold, brushed the back of Nadia's neck. Another set hovered, at her elbow, guiding without force. She smelled paper like breath. She heard a small sound from her own throat, the kind a child makes when something beautiful and terrible arrives and the body doesn't know which to choose. "Why?" she
asked the corridor. Why me? For a moment, so brief she would later doubt it had occurred, the second answered with a kind of clarity.
"Because buildings are hungry for stories. Because empty rooms rot. Because a life is heat and footsteps and sleep noises and notes on a fridge, and someone to notice when the light in the stairwell dies. Because we keep our promises here, even the ones you didn't mean to make. Because we keep time from spilling. Because there has to be a tenant." "You want someone to live here," Nadia said, and laughed in a breathless way that hurt. "You want someone to stay. We want someone to be the staying." Her hand lifted before she could refuse it. She pressed it to the glass where her other palm waited. Cold shocked her bones. Cold, yes, but disease cold, morgue cold. No, not that. It was the chill of metal kissed by night, the feel of a doorknob that no hand has touched since a building was sealed. The silver of mirrors. Her palm aligned with hers. Her breath fogged both sides of the glass at once, a shape of condensation that matched perfectly, that moved in synchronous, impossible
rhythm.
The whisper moved through her like a tide. "She's ready." The touch became a pull. Nadia tried to step back and found her feet rooted, not stuck, planted, the way a person stands when a family member reaches out for balance and you brace. Without thinking, she felt her ribs expand and contract around a breath that belonged to a woman who had once lived by knowing when to close a door and when to open it. She felt her mouth shape syllables she would not remember teaching it. "Let me." Her shoulder touched the silver. It was not a surface. It was a curve of nothing pretending to be something. It turned her, slow as courtesy, until she faced the circle fully, and the corridor faded in her peripheral vision like threads pulled from a cloth. "Please," said the Nadia on the other side, her voice, finally, as a sound. It was muffled as if through water and old plaster. In that voice lived a basement, a clock, a door that appeared where no door should be, an envelope slipped beneath, a warning about hands, a mirror that lagged, laughter where no mouths lived. In that voice lived everything she had said and would
say. And the copy of it, the building wrote in the margins. The second held perfectly still. Nadia did the smallest thing a person can do. She nodded. The seam closed over her like a lid. Afterward, though after is the wrong word for the seam, Nadia stood.
It is a surprise always that one can stand inside a mirror. It is a relief that there are flaws here, that the world has not dissolved entirely into ideas. The silver behind the glass is a thin mist that clings to skin without wetting it. The corridor on this side is narrower, and the light does not know where to go, so it collects in corners like shy cats. The air is not cold, it is the absence of temperature. She raised her hand. The circle of glass to the other side showed her hallway, crisp and lit, her door closed, the walnut frame across from it. She raised her hand because there was someone there. A woman stood in front of the mirror, her coat open, her hair mussed, her bag strap cutting a diagonal from shoulder to hip. She had the look of someone who has not chosen to be somewhere and has chosen it wholly anyway. Nadia pressed her palm to the glass. "Let me out," she mouthed, because that is what everyone says first. It is the right sentence. It is also, now, she knew, the wrong one. The woman on the other side began to cry without tears. Her mouth made shapes that could have been apologies or their opposites. She lifted her hand and laid it against Nadia's. Their fingerprints matched. Of course they did. The building did not improvise on structure. It embellished. It rewrote in the way a good editor does, keeping the bones and shading the connective tissue. Nadia felt the seam move through her. It did not hurt. It never hurts. It unthreads and rethreads. It erases redundancies, cleans up tense, changes passive to active where it can. The result feels like being made tidy. It should have felt like theft. It felt like being allowed to belong to a sentence at last. Beyond the circle, the hall clock's second hand twitched. 3:17 and 1 second. Sound rushed in like rain. The woman in the hall staggered back, hand torn from the glass. The mirror showed her staring, shaking her head, backing toward the stair with the expression of someone who has tasted the sea and will keep tasting it forever now that salt is known. Nadia took a breath she did not have to take and turned. Room 0 receded the way a dream does when a day begins. Still present, still convincing if you shut your eyes, but a thing that cannot be carried in both hands. She stepped toward the east wall of the seam. She knew its measurements now. She knew its moods. There were other circles in this wall, polished metal and glass like elevator portholes, each a little window into the place she had been. The lobby, the stairwell, the patch of floor outside the boiler room where someone had dropped a laundry basket and a sock had slipped through the grate. The landing where a kid with a skateboard had sat and texted all last summer, making up out loud with a girlfriend he would never see again. The seam kept all of it. That was its function. It held. It kept time from spilling. Nadia placed her hand on the circle that looked into her apartment. On the other side, from slightly below, she saw the kitchen counter with the bowl of clementines, the couch with its threadbare throw, the radiator that clanked like old armor, the dark window where you could sometimes see your reflection moving when you knew perfectly well you weren't. She leaned closer until her breath blurred the view, and as she watched, a slight movement in the reflection of the reflection made her smile without meaning to. It was not kindness that made her smile. It was recognition, a flicker in the walnut, frame across the hall, a shadow inside the lip of glass, something that had waited long enough to learn patience. She put her forehead politely to the circle for a moment, and then stepped back into her duties. There is always a tenant. There is always a second that cannot decide whether to pass. There is always a mirror that does more than reflect. On some mornings, when the market sign across the street clicks from off to on and back again, like a coin, indecisive about which side to show the world, the building manager stands in the hallway, hands on his hips, and frowns at the antique. "Damn thing's clean as ever," he mutters, and checks the time on his phone. The mirror gives him back a tidy version of himself. He nods at it and walks away, satisfied the world is behaving. He doesn't see the woman in the glass apace. Behind him, her hand lifted in reflex, then lowered, then lifted again because habit is its own gravity. He doesn't hear her whistle low once, the way you might call a cat you are not sure is yours yet, but others do. The ones who come alone, the ones who read letters in their own handwriting and believe them, the ones who have a coat that fits just so, and a bag strap that cuts a neat diagonal across the sternum, the ones who look down at their wristwatches at 3:16 and think of stairs. They pause, they look. The mirror lags a little, not enough to alarm, just enough to make room. Sometimes, with luck and the correct weather inside the seam, the woman in the glass manages to mouth a word before the second passes. Please, it isn't a plea properly. It is a note in the margin. It is the building reminding itself of its function. The clock strikes 3:17, then 3:17 and 1, then 2. On the glass, the fog of Nadia's breath fades and the hall shows only itself, empty and honest, in the circle. Behind the silver, the second continues to be the place where everything that could not find a place finds one. Nadia does her rounds. The seam holds. And every now and then, when the lights buzz, when the door to room 0 turns on a hinge no one built, when someone stumbles on the stair and reaches a hand out to steady themselves, Her hand is there on the other side of the glass, a palm matching a palm, a promise matching a promise, ready to be touched, ready to be the touching if you stand very close. And if the second coincides with your need, you can see her clearly. She's the woman in the mirror, the one whose mouth forms the shape of a sentence whose ending you already know. "Let me out," she says, and the building answers very gently, "We kept your signature safe."